The new wave of British heavy metal was a nationwide musical movement that started in the United Kingdom in the late 1970s and achieved international attention by the early 1980s. Journalist Geoff Barton coined the term in a May 1979 issue of the British music newspaper Sounds to describe the emergence of new heavy metal bands in the late 1970s, during the period of punk rock's decline and the dominance of new wave music, although encompassing diverse mainstream and underground styles. The music of the NWOBHM is best remembered for drawing on the heavy metal of the 1970s and infusing it with the intensity of punk rock to produce fast and aggressive songs. The DIY attitude of the new metal bands led to the spread of raw-sounding, self-produced recordings and a proliferation of independent record labels. Song lyrics were usually about escapist themes such as mythology, fantasy, horror and the rock lifestyle. The NWOBHM began as an underground phenomenon growing in parallel to punk and largely ignored by the media. It was only through the promotion of rock DJ Neil Kayan's Sounds campaigning that it reached the public consciousness and gained radio airplay, recognition and success in the UK. The movement involved mostly young, white, male and working-class musicians and fans, who suffered the hardships brought on by rising unemployment for years after the 1973-75 recession. As a reaction to the bleak reality, they created a community separate from mainstream society to enjoy each other's company and the favorite loud music. The NWOBHM was heavily criticized for the excessive hype generated by local media in favor of mostly talentless musicians. Nonetheless, it generated a renewal in the genre of heavy metal music and furthered the progress of the heavy metal subculture, whose updated behavioral and visual codes were quickly adopted by metal fans worldwide after the spread of the music to Europe, North America and Japan. The movement spawned perhaps 1,000 metal bands, but only a few survived the advent of MTV and the rise of the more commercial glam metal in the second half of the 1980s. Among them, Iron Maiden and Def Leppard became international stars, and Motorhead and Saxon had considerable success. Other groups, such as Diamond Head, Venom and Raven, remained underground but were a major influence on the successful extreme metal subgenres of the late 1980s and 1990s. Many bands from the NWOBHM reunited in the 2000s and remained active through live performances and new studio albums. Background: social unrest in the second half of the 1970s. The United Kingdom was in a state of social unrest and widespread poverty as a result of the ineffective social politics of both Conservative and Labour Party governments during a 3-year period of economic recession. As a consequence of deindustrialization, the unemployment rate was exceptionally high, especially among working-class youth. It continued to rise in the early 1980s, peaking in February 1983. The discontent of so many people caused social unrest with frequent strikes, and culminated in a series of riots. During this period, the mass of young people, deprived of the prospect of even relatively low-skill jobs that were available to the previous generations, searched for different ways to earn money in the music and entertainment businesses. The explosion of new bands and new musical styles coming from the UK in the late 1970s was a result of their efforts to make a living in the economic depression that hit the country before the governments of Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. The desperation and the violent reaction of a generation robbed of a safe future are well represented by the British punk movement of 1977-78, whose rebellion against the establishment continued diluted in the new wave and post-punk punk music of the 1980s. These self-proclaimed punks were politically militant, relishing their anarchic attitude and stage practices like pogo dancing. They wore short and spiked hairstyles or shaved heads, often with safety pins and ripped clothes, and considered musical prowess unimportant as long as the music was simple and loud. However, not all working-class male youths embraced the punk movement. Some preferred to escape from the grim reality in heavy metal, which was equally effective in providing fun, stress relief, and peer companionship, otherwise denied because of their unemployment. Heavy rock in the UK. The UK was a cradle of the first wave of heavy metal, which was born at the end of the 1960s and flowered in the early 1970s. Of the many British bands that came to prominence during that period, Led Zeppelin, Black Sabbath and Deep Purple achieved worldwide success and critical acclaim. The success of the music genre, usually called heavy rock at the time, generated a community of UK fans with strong ties to psychedelia, hippie doctrines and biker subculture. Each of these bands was in crisis in the mid to late 1970s. Led Zeppelin were plagued by discord and personal tragedies and had drastically reduced their activities. Black Sabbath finally fired the charismatic but unreliable frontman Ozzy Osbourne, and Deep Purple disbanded. As a consequence, the whole movement lost much of its momentum and media interest, which were refocused on what British writer Malc Macmillan calls the more fashionable and lucrative markets of the day, such as disco, glam, mod revival, new wave and electronic music. Just like progressive rock acts and other mainstream music groups of the 1970s, heavy rock bands were viewed as, in the words of journalist Gary Bushell, lumbering dinosaurs by a music press infatuated with punk rock and new wave. Some writers even declared the premature demise of heavy metal altogether. The crisis of British heavy rock giants left space for the rise of other rock bands in the mid-1970s, like Queen, Hawkwind, Budgie, Bad Company, Status Quo and Nazareth, all of which had multiple chart entries in the UK and had conducted successful international tours. The British chart results of the period show that there was still a vast audience for heavy metal in the country, and upcoming bands Thin Lizzy, UFO and Judas Priest also had tangible success and media coverage in the late 1970s. Foreign hard rock acts, such as Blue Oyster Cult and Kiss from the US, Rush from Canada, Scorpions from Germany, and especially AC/DC from Australia, climbed the British charts in the same period. Motorhead. The band Motorhead was founded in 1975 by already experienced musicians. The leader Ian Lemmy Kilmister was a former member of the space rock band Hawkwind. Larry Wallace had played with Pink Fairies, and Eddie Clarke had been a member of Curtis Knight's Zeus. The previous experience is one element which divides critics and fans over whether the band belongs to the new wave of British heavy metal. Some believe that the band should be considered an inspiration for the movement but not part of it, because they had signed recording contracts, toured the country, and had chart success before any NWOBHM band had stepped out of the local club scene. Motorhead were also the only metal band of the period recording songs with veteran BBC radio DJ John Peel for his Peel Sessions programme, and the first to reach #1 in the UK albums chart with the live album No Sleep Till Hammersmith in June 1981. Lemmy himself said, "The NWOBHM didn't do us much good, because Motorhead came along a bit too early for it." Other critics view Motorhead as the first significant exponent of the movement and the first band to fully implement a crossover between punk rock and heavy metal. The fast music, the renunciation of technical virtuosity in favor of sheer loudness, and their uncompromising attitude were welcomed welcomed equally by punks than heavy metal fans. Motorhead were supported by many NWOBHM bands on tour, and they also shared the stage with Lemmy's friends punk band The Damned. Motorhead's musical style became very popular during the NWOBHM, making them a fundamental reference for the nascent movement and for musicians of various metal subgenres in the following decades. Characteristics, identity and style. The NWOBHM involved both musicians and fans who were largely young, male and white, and shared class origin, ethic and aesthetic values. American sociologist Dina Weinstein, in her book Heavy Metal: The Music and Its Culture, describes the rise and growth of the movement as the achievement of maturity for heavy metal, after its birth in the early 1970s and before branching out into various subgenres in the following years. British heavy metal fans, commonly known as mothers, metalheads, are headbangers for the violent, rhythmic shaking of the heads in time to the music, dismissed the simplistic image of rebellious youth inherited from the counterculture of the 1960s and the psychedelic attachments characteristic of heavy rock in the 1970s, updating the shared principles and codes of the heavy metal subculture and definitely separating it from mainstream society. Towards the end of the 1970s, British metalheads coalesced into a closed community of peers that exalted power and celebrated masculinity. According to Dina Weinstein's analysis, the male camaraderie and the general absence of women in the ranks did not turn into machismo and misogyny. In the same article, she wrote that British heavy metal is not racist, despite its uniformly white performers, and its lyrics are devoid of racial references. Another characteristic of the subculture was its latent homophobia, less violent but not dissimilar to British skinheads' disposition. In his book Running with the Devil: Power, Gender and Madness in Heavy Metal Music, Robert Walser calls it a collective affirmation of heterosexuality, and in a journal British sociologist John Clark regards it as a reaction against the erosion of traditionally available stereotypes of masculinity. Headbangers showed little interest in political and social problems, finding in each other's company, in the consumption of beer and in the music, the means to escape the bleak reality. For this reason they were often accused of nihilism or escapism. In contrast with punks, they loved musicianship and made idols of virtuoso guitarists and vocalists, viewing the live show as the full realization of the status. The fans were very loyal to the music, to each other and to the bands with whom they shared origins and from whom they required coherence with the values, authenticity and continuous accessibility. To depart from this strict code meant being marked as a sellout or poser, and being somewhat excluded from the community. The lyrics of the song Denim and Leather by Saxon reflect precisely the condition of British metalheads in those years of great enthusiasm. Access to this male-dominated world for female musicians and fans was not easy, and only women who adapted to the male counterpart's standards and codes were accepted, as attested by Girl School and Rock Goddess, the only notable all-female metal bands of that era. The music, philosophy and lifestyle of heavy metal bands and fans were often panned by both left-wing critics and conservative public opinion, described as senseless, ridiculous to the limit of self-parody, and even dangerous for the young generation. The 1984 mockumentary This Is Spinal Tap addressed many idiosyncrasies of British metal bands, showing comic sides of that world which external observers would judge absurd. Instead, metal musicians regarded the movie's content as much too real. Visual aspects. The dress code of the British headbangers reflected the newly found cohesion of the movement and recalled the look of 1960s rockers and American bikers. The common elements were long hair and jeans, black or white t-shirts with band logos and cover art, and leather jackets or denim vests adorned with patches. Following the example of Judas Priest, elements of NWOBHM fashion entered the metal wardrobe of the 1980s, and it became typical to show off metallic studs and ornaments, or for metal musicians to wear spandex or leather trousers. Elements of militaria, such as bullet belts and insignia, were also introduced at this time. This style of dress quickly became the uniform of metalheads worldwide. Most bands of the NWOBHM had the same look as the fans and produced rock shows without special visual effects. A notable exception was Iron Maiden, which created the grisly character Eddie the Head as a stage prop to enrich the performances very early in their career. Other exceptions were Demon, Cloven Hoof and Samson, which used various props, costumes and tricks in the shows, while Pagan Altar and Venom became well known for their elaborate scenography inspired by shock rock and Satanism. Musical and lyrical elements. The NWOBHM, comprising bands with very different influences and styles, was promoted as both a movement and a distinct music genre only in its formative years during the mid to late 1970s. Especially in those early years, what characterized the flood of new music was its raw sound, due in large part to low-budget productions, but also to the amateurish talents of many young bands. Those young musicians were also linked by a shared inspiration from the works of the aforementioned successful heavy rock bands of the late 1960s and 1970s, and kept a sort of continuity with the earlier acts, whose music had temporarily gone out of fashion but was still thriving underground. However, the media of the 1980s and the promotional literature of record labels typically placed rock music that employed loud guitars but was not classifiable as punk under the blanket term heavy metal, subsuming the entire spectrum of NWOBHM bands within a single music genre. Following a largely organic and uncalculated impulse, many of these new bands infused classic heavy metal with the immediacy of pub rock and the intensity of punk rock, implementing to various degrees the crossover of genres started by Motorhead. In general, they shunned ballads, emphasized harmonies and produced shorter songs with fast tempos and a very aggressive sound based on riffs and power chords, featuring vocals ranging from high-pitched wails to gruff and low growls. Iron Maiden, Angel Witch, Saxon, Holocaust, Tigers of Pantang, Girl School, Tank and more are notable performers of this style, which bands such as Atomcraft, Jaguar, Raven and Venom stretch to produce even more extreme results. Critics consider this new approach to heavy metal the greatest musical accomplishment of the NWOBHM and an important evolutionary step for the genre, a style more melodic and more akin to the hard rock of bands like Rainbow, Magnum, UFO. Thin Lizzy and Whitesnake was equally represented during the NWOBHM. The music of Def Leppard, Praying Mantis, White Spirit, Demon, Shy, Gascon, Deadringer and many others, contained hooks as much as riffs, often retained a closer link with blues rock, included power ballads and featured keyboards, acoustic instruments and melodic and soaring vocals. After the peak of the movement in 1981, this style was was favored by the media and gained greater acceptance among the British audience. It became prevalent when bands usually playing the more aggressive style of metal adapted to the more popular sound, which resembled that of mainstream American acts. These changes in musical direction disoriented some fans and led them to reject those bands which were perceived as having compromised key elements of the musical identity in the pursuit of success. These two styles do not exhaust all of the musical influences found in the British metal music of the early 1980s, because many bands were also inspired by progressive rock, boogie rock and glam rock. Doom metal bands Peg and Alter and Witchfind a General were also part of the NWOBHM, and their albums are considered among the best examples of that already established subgenre. British writer John Tucker writes that NWOBHM bands were in general fueled by the first experiences with adult life, and their lyrics roll everything into one big youthful fantasy. They usually avoided social and political themes in the lyrics, or treated them in a shallow, street-level way, preferring topics from mythology, the occult, fantasy, science fiction and horror films. Songs about romance and lust were rare, but the frequent lyrics about male bonding and the rock lifestyle contain many sexist allusions. Christian symbolism is often present in the lyrics and cover art, as is the figure of Satan, used more as a shocking and macabre subject than as the anti-religious device of 1990s black metal subculture.